What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and I recently realized there's a story where Thanos meets Kang, and it's kind of a cool thing, right? So, we covered the story of Infinity Conflict a little while ago, and this is basically the prelude to that. So those of you guys who read or who saw our videos on Infinity Conflict, you guys kind of know how this turns out, but it is a little bit of a cool thing here, right? So this initially picks up with Thanos just kind of re-experiencing or kind of going through all the various victories he's experienced over the years, and even defeats he's experienced over the years while he's in the realm of Mistress Death. Now, for those of you guys who don't know, when it comes to the realm of Mistress Death in Marvel Comics, we've talked about this, so those of you guys who are familiar with this, just bear with me for a second while I run over this for the new folks. Originally, Death didn't work this way in Marvel Comics. Instead, if you go back and you look at the old Stan Lee, Jack Kirby stories, right, Tales of Asgard, all you really had was the realm of Hela, and that was basically it. It wasn't until the old Iron Man stories and the introduction of Mistress Death and Thanos that you basically learned there is a definitive afterlife for anybody who doesn't follow like the Asgardian mythos, basically. And so following that, basically the realm of Mistress Death is where people go when they all just more or less die, right? Earthlings, things like that. And then places like the realm of Mephisto or the realm of Hela, the realm of Satanish, different things like that, are all kind of special circumstances for people who barter certain deals or different things along those lines. But for the longest time, Thanos was always rebuked by Mistress Death. And a lot of you guys probably know that he had a kind of love interest in the form of the fact that he was always pursuing the affections of Mistress Death and she was always shooting him down. And so that was kind of the cornerstone of him, nihilism, things like that. And there was actually a point in Marvel Comics when he was banned from the realm of Mistress Death. Now that's where the Infinity line of stories sort of differentiate from the main Marvel universe. And the reason why is because the Infinity Gauntlet was a landmark story. It was huge when it first dropped. And then of course, Jim Starlin followed up with that with the Infinity War and the Infinity Crusade. But the Infinity line of comics proved to be so popular that Marvel just gave him the ability to write his own stories. And so following the events of Infinity Crusade, those stories largely became out of continuity, right? So they don't necessarily tie into the main Marvel universe. And so you'll see events unfold, but they're all just kind of alternate reality stories. For example, in the aftermath of Jonathan Hickman's Avengers and New Avengers, Secret Wars, The Death of the Living Tribunal, in the Infinity stories, Adam Warlock in an alternate reality became the new Living Tribunal. Now that was in continuity in Marvel Comics only because the Living Tribunal is a multiversal being. So if somebody in an alternate reality replaces him, it's basically the new Living Tribunal across the entirety of the multiverse, including the main Marvel universe. But outside of that, everything else is basically out of continuity. And so with Thanos kind of reliving all these experiences and coming to this realization that he really seems to have everything he wants, that he's still not content. And so he kind of goes on this quest, or really kind of goes on a bit of a journey to figure out what it is that leads him to lack being content with his current environment. And so you switch over to Eros. Now, those of you guys who are not familiar with comics, Eros is basically the brother of Thanos, that he also goes by the name Star Fox, and his ability is to kind of, emit pheromones to basically get people to do almost anything he wants, especially to kind of fall in love with him or to see him as desirable. That's why you initially see him in bed with just like 5 chicks, because that's kind of the thing of Eros. He usually uses his powers in order to get girls, is really what it is. But in the midst of him just kind of musing to himself and sort of, walking around and so on and so forth, he's basically kind of whisked away through a kind of time portal. And then on the other side, a new portal opens and you're met with Kang the Conqueror and basically an unfamiliar individual. Now, following that, as far as Eros goes, he's kind of whisked away to basically a different point in time on a prehistoric world and is really just kind of trying to escape as best he can and get away from things. But for Thanos himself, basically he's met by Corvus Glaive, one of the Coal Obsidian, and he's essentially told that a kind of temporal disruption has emerged on Titan, and that's interesting enough for Thanos to investigate, right? At the very least, it's, hey, like I can go do something now to kind of fulfill this lack of contentment that I have and essentially find out what's going on here, right? And so when he emerges on the scene, he's basically met by this kind of individual who's kind of disappeared, and Kang the Conqueror, who is basically left. And so with this cloaked individual, he basically reveals himself to be what is in effect a future version of Eros, right? And so time travel, of course, is being invoked here. Now, one of the funny things that goes on is that with Kang the Conqueror, when he had emerged, he was trying to stay away from Thanos. And the reason why is because Thanos is one of these characters in Marvel where he's not easily killed. More so than that, if Thanos comes across you and realizes you're not supposed to be there, or that you could offer some measure of him to achieve a goal he's been setting out to achieve, he'll take you, right? He'll conscript you, or he'll kill you, or something along those lines. But one of the things to know is that Thanos is well beyond the power of Kang the Conqueror. And so there's not a whole lot Kang could do in facing off against Thanos. Not only that, because Thanos is so wildly intelligent, say for example that Kang were to appear at a previous point in time, then Thanos would likely deduce that Kang had appeared to him at a future point in time, realized he couldn't defeat him, and so he came back to a previous point point to try to destroy him and then end up destroying Kang, right? So it's one of those things where Thanos' intelligence is such a high level that he can kind of figure things out pretty quickly. And so what you end up finding out is that when this future version of Eros kind of starts telling a story about why it is that he looks so old and, what was going on with him in the future and so on and so forth, he reveals that one, it's been 2,000 years since he and Thanos saw each other, and that two, he was basically in a kind of exile for 2,000 years, on basically what was this kind of world called Zelchia, and that when he came here, when he stumbled across this world, that he came across a primitive race that tried to destroy him, and for the most part, it was only because of the fact that on this world, there's only 3 different races, and anybody who doesn't match that race, they kind of see him as basically an edible animal, right? In the same way that we would see like a deer or something like that as something that we can hunt and kill. And so ultimately, Eros is saved by one of the other races here, and the reason why they saved him is they realized he had a ship, right? So he's not necessarily of that world. And so in turn, they were like, you can probably help us. At the very least, help us to kind of win this conflict, because these 3 races are always at war with each other. And so as this bit of a story kind of goes on, you end up finding out that this version of Eros had basically helped this race to achieve, a higher state of enlightenment with regards to weapons, technology, being able to like evacuate their world using ships and things like that. So basically ushered in a kind of technological golden age for this particular race, right? And in doing that, kind of gave them the tools they needed to evolve beyond the stars, or to travel beyond the stars. That's incredibly important here. And the reason why is because what you also end up finding out around that time is that Kang the Conqueror, as he was going through his timeline and really the history of the universe itself, and always trying to expand his empire, came to the realization that at a future point in time, Thanos would come across basically what he referred to as a Stygian darkness, basically kind of like a mysterious phenomena that essentially encapsulated a world, traveled beyond that world into the stars, and then eventually fought Thanos and destroyed Thanos. And so the desire of Kang the Conqueror is to essentially keep that from happening. And the reason why is because any force out there that's powerful enough to destroy Thanos, especially in this higher state of godhood that he seemed to have achieved, is a threat to the entirety of the universe, and by extension, a threat to the life of Kang the Conqueror. Because remember, when it comes, the way that Jim Starlin's writing this, which again is kind of out of continuity here, that if something affects the past, it can affect the future. And so looking at this, the concern of Kang the Conqueror is that if a organization or race basically conquered the universe at that point in time, then it's entirely possible it could spread outward. And because it seems like it's not supposed to exist, somebody had meddled with time and in turn caused this whole thing in the first place. And so the desire of Kang is to ensure that it doesn't spread beyond the stars, and it doesn't spread throughout the entirety of the time stream, and in turn basically destroy Kang's empire and even control Kang himself. And so tracing this back to its genesis point, Kang believed that it all started on a planet named Zelchia with people that had the ability to teleport, basically this race that Eros had come across while he was essentially exiled. And the desire of Kang was to basically kill this first teleporter and then in turn stop that from happening. The problem is that it didn't work, that throughout the time stream this always kept on happening, that this Stygian darkness, this kind of powerful entity out there, kept showing up again and again and again. And there came a point where Kang got so close to it that it almost consumed him. And so in a panic, he basically sent his ship flying through the time stream with no definitive arrival point. And he ultimately stumbled across this barren world 2,000 years into the future, which basically housed Eros, where he had basically been defeated and kind of removed and exiled to that planet. And by the two of them working together, they ultimately cultivated a plan that was designed for the purpose of Eros coming back here and trying to find a way to work with Thanos to stop that Stygian darkness from happening. And so the way this plan, the plan that the two of them concoct, is that at the end of the day, the race on that planet Zelchia is going to have to go, right? Because of the fact that it all originates from there, that essentially they're going to put together, or at least as far as the plan that Kang and Eros had formed, that Thanos would assemble what is in effect a small little contingent team, and they would in turn travel to this world and they would basically lay waste to all life on it. And that in doing so, it should stop that Stygian darkness from arriving here. Now, as far as the version of Eros goes that had been thrown into the past, much like the future version of himself, he had kind of given this race weaponry, taught them technology, all kinds of different things, the ability to travel into space. And so the hope here is that in doing that, they would basically present themselves as a more intelligent and capable organism. And that the hope is that if Thanos truly dies in the future, that because this race is going to basically has their evolution kind of jump started by Eros and basically giving them advanced technologies, which partially come from the Shi'ar Empire, they would be able to help Thanos quell that threat in the future. And that in doing so, Thanos is basically not going to destroy Eros. He can return to his own timeline and essentially not be destroyed or kind of exiled at some future point point in time. The problem with all this is that in both of these scenarios, they basically solidify what's going on with this Stygian darkness, that this race gaining interstellar travel by way of Eros is really what causes all this. And the reason why is because one of the members of this race who's here is basically met by the cause of this Stygian darkness, right? The cause of this kind of walking death that exists out there. And this person comes in the form of a being called Hunger. Now, those of you guys who are familiar with Jim Starlin's whole story with hunger and all that kind of stuff, this is one of those concepts where comic book fans either think it's cool or they hate it. And for the most part, the only people who really liked it were diehard Jim Starlin fans. Everybody else was like, this is ridiculous. This basically sucks. The whole thing behind this is that Hunger was basically an extra dimensional being that basically latched itself onto Galactus. And it was kind of Jim Starlin's way of saying, this is why Galactus desires to consume everything, because he's actually possessed by a being called Hunger. Ultimately, it was defeated and largely believed to have been destroyed. The reality is that it's returned here. And the way this explanation is given to us is that at some point, because of the fact that Hunger came from an extra dimensional space, it had kind of been manipulating things the entire time. And that entering into this realm, that it needed a source of energy to basically achieve this. So it basically rode the Infinity Stones into this new reality, bonded itself to Galactus, and then in turn, when Galactus and Thanos fought, that when it was believed that Hunger was destroyed, a small piece of it survived, it left Galactus, and then traveled throughout the universe, trying to find a suitable host to bond itself to. And that's when it arrived on this world and bonded itself to this one of these three races, and then in turn rode itself into the future, and then ultimately ended up conquering and destroying Thanos, right? So this is the actual darkness that everybody, or really that Kang and all those guys were essentially concerned about. And so the other part of this is that what you end up getting is Thanos, who's essentially whisked away into what's referred to as elsewhere, but is really more of a far-flung future. And he's kind of met by this, kind of disembodied voice that basically tells him that what's going to happen here with regards to everything taking place with Eros and all that kind of stuff, that in the end, it is all still going to result in Thanos dying. No matter what plan they implement here, that hunger is going to spread throughout the universe and it is going to kill Thanos, and that ultimately hunger will consume all things. And so in order to keep that from happening, the plan of Eros and Kang is not going to work. And so another plan needs to be manufactured here. The problem with this is that if Eros, for example, is killed, then it'll basically lead to a paradox in the time stream. And so what ends up happening is Thanos kind of shows up here on the scene and basically ends up encountering his brother Eros when he shows up at this point in the timeline. And so arriving here, Eros is basically attacked by Thanos, who basically, seems to more or less kill him and then just throw him out into the middle of nowhere. And so following that, because of the fact that the only way to basically keep that future from happening where the universe is conquered by hunger and everybody is eradicated is for Thanos to wipe out the entirety of this race. And this is appealing to Thanos because, as you guys know, Thanos loves the concept of death, and Thanos loves to destroy all things that exist. And so this basically leads to Thanos kind of amassing a fleet based on the new plan that was created between himself and this disembodied voice that was talking to him, the person that we don't see. And they basically eradicate everything here, which is the other reason why Eros was basically killed by Thanos. And so in the midst of all of this, right, like with these members of these races basically evacuating based on the ships that were given to them by Eros, this whole plan of Thanos and his future version doesn't necessarily work out the way that they intended. And so this conversation between Thanos and his future self basically continues when you end up finding out that it's basically revealed to Thanos that even though he was believed to have been successful, even though he thought he had killed enough members of this race, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter, right? The true architect of this whole Stygian darkness will basically arrive, and in turn, he'll end up conscripting what's left of this race across the universe into his army, and that at the end of the day, Thanos will still die. And so ultimately, the only real way to stop this is to actually go after that source itself. And so this leads to Thanos eventually tracking down Hunger and then annihilating Hunger, right? Destroying this bit of an entity here. Now, of course, Hunger tries to possess Thanos, and it doesn't necessarily work out that way. Instead, Thanos manages to destroy Hunger entirely, and that basically brings an end to that. And so following that, you basically find that because future Eros is alive, that means that Eros in the past was not actually destroyed. That instead, it was kind of a paralytic effect that was imposed on him by Thanos, and his body was just kind of thrown into the lake, and then that was basically it. And that it was really more of a distraction than anything else, all for the purpose of solidifying this plan. More so than that, you end up having Kang the Conqueror that just kind of appears here and then is met by the arrival of Thanos, right? And the whole point was that Thanos was meeting with Kang for this idea that in solidifying the destruction of this particular, of really Hunger itself, that now Kang is in the debt of Thanos. And so in turn, the question Kang has is, then what do we do here? And Thanos Thanos' response is like, what are you looking for? I've destroyed this guy. Like, what all do you want out of me, or what are you looking to achieve? And the idea is that Kang really simply just wants to rule a section of the universe for himself, right? A section of the multiverse for himself, and that Thanos will leave him that section, right? Because Thanos is destined to achieve this level of godhood. That's basically what Kang says. I know what your future is going to be. I know what you're going to look like. I know the level of power you're going to achieve. And when that time comes, what I ask is that you allow me to rule my little section here, and you basically leave me alone, right? Because at the end of the day, if that doesn't happen, Thanos will end up destroying Kang. And so if anything, it's really just self-preservation. And so ultimately the response to Thanos is, fine, I will do that, but you will owe me a debt, right? Like, you owe me a debt here in order for me to allow you to kind of rule your own section. And then in turn, the whole thing here is Thanos basically says, like, you will basically travel to the year 4027 and you'll wait in orbit above Chandelar. And then in turn, you'll be met with orders and you'll be told what to do. And so that all that really does is kind of solidify Thanos's role here, right? The fact that he is in effect going to become his future counterpart. Now, when you switch over to this quote unquote elsewhere discussion, you end up basically finding out the whole story is more or less told in hindsight. And all this is done for the purpose of solidifying what Thanos will become. That there does come a future point in time when Thanos basically becomes the universe itself. Now, it actually goes beyond that, right? When he attains the astral regulator, which again is the whole idea behind Infinity Conflict, and he basically imbues himself with everything, right? He becomes like, he takes over the living tribunal, he absorbs the one above all, he takes over Mistress Death, the whole 9 yards, right? Like, he becomes what is in effect the entirety of God. And the whole basis behind this story of everything that's happened was done for the purpose of ensuring, as far as that future Thanos goes, that his existence actually is maintained, right? That nothing gets in the way and nothing stops that. More so than that, because hunger was seemingly this universe-wide credible threat, and the only thing that really seemed to be powerful enough to actually stop Astral Regulator Thanos, that this is now quelled and it's out of the picture and it's done. And so basically there's no one standing in the way of Astral Regulator Thanos becoming this most powerful version of himself. Now, that story does play out in the actual Infinity Conflict, and you guys can check the video down in the description. Nonetheless, let me know what you guys think down in the comments section. If you guys say like, yeah, Rob, this story sucked, I totally understand. I don't like it at all. But thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.